Peter's life took a drastic turn when the woman he cherished and trusted betrayed him in ways he could never have foreseen. This story begins in a seemingly ordinary house, adorned with all the trappings of a successful marriage and a life built on what appeared to be a strong foundation. Peter, 45, a corporate strategist known for his meticulous nature, had been married to Carol for 22 years. Together, they had climbed the corporate ladder, created a beautiful home, and constructed a life that, from the outside, seemed flawless. But, as is often the case, appearances can be deceptive. Peter valued order, and his life had been a well-oiled machine up to this point. He had designed their home with precision, paying special attention to the dining room, a space rarely used but symbolic of their shared success. The mahogany table, the exquisite crystal chandelier, and the fine china were all representations of a life well lived. However, the dining room was mostly ornamental. Their real sanctuary was the kitchen. There, Carol would prepare meals while Peter reviewed work emails, the two of them silently coexisting, engrossed in their respective tasks. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Peter first sensed a shift. The change had been subtle at first, small moments that left him uneasy, but nothing pressing enough to demand immediate action. That was until one night when Carol entered his home office. Peter was at his desk, immersed in reports, when the sound of her high heels clicking on the hardwood floor caught his attention. She paused in the doorway, calling out to him in a voice sharper than usual. Focused on his work, Peter didn't respond immediately. After a beat, he replied, his tone unintentionally cheerful, "I'm here, Carol. Come in." She stepped into the room, her expression a mix of impatience and something Peter couldn't quite pinpoint. Normally composed, tonight there was an edge to her demeanor that gave him pause. She rolled her eyes as she crossed the room, sinking into the chair opposite his desk with a sigh. "What is it, Peter?" she asked, her voice laced with irritation. Peter had been waiting for this moment, the unease within him building for weeks. It started with little signs, her distraction, her haste to leave for work, and her delayed responses to his calls. Something was off, and Peter was determined to address it. "I need to ask you something, Carol," he began, striving to keep his voice even. "And I need you to be honest with me. This isn't a hypothetical question, I want a real answer." Carol's eyebrow arched, her expression cautious as she sensed the weight of his words. "Go on," she said, her tone guarded. Taking a deep breath, Peter tapped his fingers on the desk, gathering his thoughts. "Tell me, in monetary terms, how much do you think intimacy with you is worth?" The question hung in the air, heavy and startling. Carol stared at him, her lips slightly parted, unable to respond immediately. Finally, she managed to whisper, "What?" her voice a mix of disbelief and shock. Peter pressed on, his tone unwavering. "I'm asking for honesty, Carol. Do you think intimacy has a price? Different acts, different rates. Escorts have their rates, though I don't know the specifics, I imagine it's quite high. You'd know better than I would, wouldn't you? What do you think your value is?" Her eyes narrowed as her hands gripped the arms of the chair. She shifted uncomfortably. "Peter, what are you talking about? This is absurd. Why are you even asking me this?" "I'm serious," Peter replied, his voice calm but insistent. "Should enthusiasm, skill, or details like lingerie, candles, and mood lighting be factored in? Or does it depend on the setting, a fancy hotel, a cheap motel, or just a casual dinner?" Carol blinked, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and confusion. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, shaking her head. "This isn't about money, Peter, it's about trust." Peter leaned forward, his tone now laced with sarcasm. "So, you're saying it's about trust? Then explain, Carol, because it certainly looks like you've been spending a lot of time with someone else." "Someone who isn't me." Carol's expression faltered. She looked away briefly, her gaze darting to the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered. "Peter, it's not what you think," she said, though the lack of conviction betrayed her. "It's just dinner. I'm going to dinner with James tonight." Peter's heart sank at the name. "James," he repeated, his voice low, disbelieving. The name hit him like a cold stone. James was her co-worker, someone Peter had always been wary of. The familiarity between them had always felt like more than just professional camaraderie. Hearing it confirmed was devastating. "Yes, Peter," Carol said, her lips tightening. "It's just dinner. We've been working on a project, and we thought it'd be easier to discuss over a meal." Peter's mind raced. This wasn't about dinner or a work project. The distance, the lies, the secrecy, it all added up now. "Carol, you've been distant for weeks," he said, his voice sharp. "The way you talk about him, the way you look at him, it's clear to me now. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." Carol fidgeted in her chair, her hands trembling. "Peter, I swear, there's nothing going on," she insisted, though her voice cracked as she spoke. Peter shook his head, his voice cold and resolute. "I've seen the late nights, the texts, the way you light up around him. You're not fooling me anymore." Carol's face flushed, her eyes brimming with tears. But Peter had no interest in her excuses anymore. "If you go to that dinner," he said firmly, "consider this the beginning of the end. I'll never trust you again." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling between them. Without another word, Carol stood, her chair scraping against the floor. She left the room, leaving Peter alone in the suffocating quiet. That night, Peter sat in the silence, the truth laid bare, and their life as they knew it irrevocably changed. The echo of her heels against the polished hardwood floor reverberated through the house as she stormed out, slamming the door behind her with a force that seemed to shake the walls. Yet, for all the noise she made, it couldn't drown out the relentless ringing in Peter's ears, the sharp, persistent sting of betrayal that cut deeper than he'd ever imagined. Peter sat motionless in his chair, staring at the spot where Carol had been just moments ago. His mind raced, replaying every moment, every lie she'd told, and every fleeting glance that now seemed laden with hidden meaning. He had always been a man who thrived on control. His work, his home, his relationships, all aspects of his life were meticulously organized, structured, and predictable. Until now. Now, Carol, the woman he had devoted over 2 decades of his life to, had shattered that careful order with a single, devastating blow. And it wasn't just the fact that she was seeing someone else. No, it was the deception, the lies she had spun like a web, threading through their lives and tangling him in their deceit until nothing was left but the fragile remnants of what they once shared. Peter prided himself on being a man of reason, someone who could remain level-headed even in the most challenging situations. But this? This was unlike anything he had ever faced. This wasn't a crisis he could solve with logic or a problem he could fix with careful planning. This was personal, a wound that cut to the core of who he was. As the hours dragged on, the weight of her betrayal pressed heavier on his chest. His mind, usually so clear and methodical, began to spiral into darker territory. Slowly, a plan began to form, a plan born not of anger, but of cold, calculated resolve. Carol returned home late that night, the clock on the hallway wall reading just past 1 a.m. The sharp clack of her heels against the stone tiles echoed through the dimly lit entryway. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfastened her coat. The evening had not gone as planned. The dinner with James had been pleasant, too pleasant. They'd shared laughs and polite conversation, but beneath the surface, Carol had sensed a tension she couldn't quite place. The way he looked at her, the way his hand lingered just a moment too long when he passed her the wine glass, it all felt like an unspoken line was being crossed. As she stepped further into the house, the living room lights flickered on, and there he was. Peter. Sitting in the same chair he'd occupied when she left, his presence was like a shadow that refused to be ignored. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes told a different story, dark, intense, and unreadable. He said nothing as she entered, his silence more oppressive than any shouted accusation could have been. She closed the door behind her with a soft click and stood there, unsure of what to say. Her hand lingered on the doorknob as if it might offer some sense of stability. "Peter," she began hesitantly, her voice unsteady. But he silenced her with a raised hand, the gesture sharp and final. "Sit," he ordered, his tone colder than she had ever heard before. The weight of his command left no room for argument. Carol crossed the room slowly, lowering herself into the chair across from him. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, like a storm about to break. Peter's gaze bore into her, unwavering and relentless. He studied her in a way that made her feel exposed, as though he could see every thought, every secret she was trying to hide. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge that made her skin crawl. "Do you think I'm stupid, Carol?" he asked, his words measured and deliberate. Her throat tightened, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "What are you talking about?" she managed to say, though her voice wavered. "Don't play games with me," Peter snapped, the sharpness in his tone cutting through the room like a knife. "I know about James. Do you think I haven't noticed? The late nights, the whispers, the way you look at him as if he's the only person in the room. Don't insult me by pretending nothing's going on." Carol's stomach churned, a cold dread washing over her. "Peter, it's not like that," she insisted, her voice trembling. "You're making something out of nothing." "Am I?" Peter asked, rising from his chair with a deliberate slowness that made her pulse quicken. He leaned in close, his face just inches from hers. "You went to dinner with him. Alone. And now you come back here expecting me to believe it's all perfectly innocent. Tell me, Carol, did he kiss you? Did you kiss him?" The accusation made her cheeks flush with a mix of anger and shame. "No," she exclaimed, recoiling slightly. "Peter, I swear, nothing happened." Peter let out a bitter laugh, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Do you honestly expect me to believe that?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "After all the lies, after everything you've done, you think I'd believe you?" He straightened, taking a step back and regarding her with a cold, calculating expression. "This isn't about whether something happened, Carol. It's about the fact that you thought you could get away with it. You thought you could betray me, break my trust, and walk back into this house as if nothing had changed. But you were wrong.